This is the best telephoto lens that you can get for landscape photography. And that's all you need to know. Thanks for watching. What's up, y'all? So Project Photography back with another video, and today I've been using this lens, the Nikon Z 20-400mm f4-8 VR, for about the past month. And I've used it on a ton of different shoots to capture a lot of landscape photography and with a bunch of different cameras. And today I'm ready to make my full review on this lens. So with that being said, let's get started and talk about the ergonomics. And start with its size, because the 20-400 is not a small lens by any means. It is quite long, and relative to something like a 24-200, I want to say it's around 20% larger. And the thing with this is that when you're packing it inside of your backpack, you do have to make sure to have enough room for it, because especially this paired with something like a full frame camera, that is going to take up quite a bit of space. And something pretty significant to note is that when you are zooming out, it does extend to almost twice the size of this lens. Now this can be a little bit of an issue when you're trying to balance this lens on a tripod. You definitely have to account for that when you are capturing landscape photography, and especially if you're changing that focal length a lot, you have to be cognizant of that. But it being a 400mm lens in such a small form factor, yes, it is big relative to other lenses, but for a 400mm lens, I really like the size of it. It's not overly big to the point where you have to rearrange your entire bag just to fit it, and it's not super heavy to the point where you're like, oh, this is just a honking log to carry around. Having this much power in such a small form factor is absolutely incredible. This is exactly what you want in a lightweight telephoto lens. And relative to something like a 100-400, like I'm carrying this all day, every day, because 100-400 is pretty much the same size as something like a 70-200, but with the 20-400, it's a lot smaller, a lot more compact, and I just love having that 400mm in such a small form factor. But speaking about its weight, this lens does come in at 725 grams. Now, I think that's a pretty respectable weight for this lens. I mean, we're not talking about a lens that's like over a kilogram, but it's not going to be so heavy to the point where we're going to make a noticeable difference inside of your backpack. Yes, I'm a big believer that you should decrease the weight as much as possible, but I think relative to how much more focal length you're getting, I think the trade-off is completely worth it. I think it balances really well with something like a full frame camera in particular, but with my Nikon Z30, it is pretty lens heavy because that camera is quite small. But especially using the Z30 and the 20-400 on a tripod, you can definitely feel that weight, and you're gonna have to add a little bit more support. But I don't think it's a huge issue, something you just have to work around, especially if you want to use it with an APS-C size body. So something that a lot of people had some concerns over when it came to this lens is the plastic build. And yes, it is plastic, but to me, this wasn't a huge deal because I've used a 24-200 and I thought that lens held up pretty well. I think we're getting pretty similar performance along those same lines to that 24-200. This plastic is quite nice. Honestly, it doesn't even scratch that much relative to other lenses like the 28mm or the 17-28. So I'm really happy in that regards. And I haven't had any issues with it so far, and I think it's gonna hold up pretty well in the long term. And I'm actually pretty happy that they went with a plastic build, because I feel like if they added just more metal, then it would make this a lot heavier of a lens. And honestly, that trade-off between the plastic build and the weight is one that I'll take every single day of the week, especially for a telephoto lens. Something else that's important to note is the zooming mechanism. One thing that I found is that it's actually quite tight. This may seem like a bad thing if you want to shoot something like bird photography or something where you need to get to that focal length really fast. But for landscape photography, I actually am a fan of this, because when we're trying to get our nice composition, whatever it is we're shooting, like a mountain range or something, I like having that as a slow zoom because we're able to dial in on the exact focal length we want, and I think it just capture a better composition overall. Something that I realized when shooting is that this lens actually does have a speck of dust in it. This lens is not that old, it's only around a month old. And I think a big part of it has to do with this zooming barrel. Like if you just take a look at this, when you zoom it in and out, that is a lot of space for the lens to work with. And I think that just allows for more dust to be sucked in. And now I know this lens is dust and water resistant. It should be able to protect against this. And the fact that there is some dust in there, it's something just significant to note, and I kind of wanted to put out there. And when it comes to the focusing ring, I think they did a really good job on it. It's nice and ribbed, so it has a nice bit of texture. I think this will be especially nice when you're using gloves. Now you'll know exactly what you're turning. And on top of it, the ring itself is very smooth, very easy to turn, and this lens does support linear focusing, which is really nice, especially paired with my Nikon Z6 III. And I found out that not all lenses support linear focusing, and so it's really nice that this one does, especially for landscape photography. And if we take a look on the side here, we do have a locking switch that will essentially lock this lens in place so that it doesn't zoom out. And I think this is really nice, especially for these longer lenses that can zoom out pretty long, because you don't want it zooming inside of your camera bag and potentially damaging the lens. lens. So I'm really glad they included this. But something I'm not that happy about is that I wish they included a AF/MS switch, especially for a lens like this. I mean, it just makes so much more sense to have an AF/MS switch. It's so much easier to switch between autofocus and manual focus. And with landscape photography, we're pretty much manual focusing 99.9% of the time anyway, so which they include on here. And last but not least, we have a 77mm filter thread on here. And for me, I always have 82mm filters anyway, so I use a step of brain to go ahead and put my filters on it. Just makes it so that you can throw on ND filters and be able to get that lower shutter speed if you want to blur out motion like water, for example. But of course, ergonomics is not the only part of this lens. And in fact, focal length is probably the most important part of this lens, because we have a focal range of 28 to 400. So let's talk about the 400mm on long end first, because 400mm is very, very long for a telephoto lens. And I think this is especially nice because it gives me so much peace of mind to know that whatever composition that comes my way, I can go ahead and grab it, at least with the telephoto side. 400mm is not a focal length that I'm going to be shooting at all the time. In fact, I find myself a lot of times shooting between the 100 and 300mm side, but it just gives you that peace of mind to know that you can capture literally anything that you want. But something really interesting to note about going to that longer focal length is that when you're using it on a tripod, it does make it a little bit more difficult to capture that exact composition, because I would set up my camera on my tripod, go ahead and turn the knobs to go ahead and tighten it, but then I would notice that the camera lens would just like sag a little bit and then my composition would go down. That is kind of significant because then I have to constantly keep on readjusting my composition to be able to capture the exact image that I want. And I think it's simply a product of a few things. First of all, because this lens zooms out quite a bit, the center of mass just kind of moves out more towards the end, so it does make the lens sag. But then also just going to 400mm in general, it's just really long. A small change in terms of your camera movement is going to make a big difference when it comes to your composition. Something else to really note is that when you are going to that longer focal length, you do have to deal with a lot more atmospheric conditions, especially if it's an overcast day or there's just a lot of fog in the sky. You're going to have to deal with it, and when you're going to 400mm, it's just exaggerated a lot more. This will probably lead to a decrease in sharpness, contrast, and stuff like that. But let's talk about the wide angle side, because on the wide angle side, we have a 28mm focal length. Now, this isn't super wide for landscape photography, and most of the time I prefer having something like a 14mm. 28 to 400 is a really, really long focal range, and I feel like with 28mm, you're able to grab just that nice standard zoom range of, let's just say, like a 28 to 105, for example. And I think that just gives you a lot of different options in terms of the different types of focal lengths that you want to capture. And majority of the time, if I'm out shooting landscape photography, I am pairing this with a wide angle lens anyways. So for me, that would be my 14 to 30. So we're able to cover a lot of those different focal lengths anyways. So I'm not necessarily worried about, oh, the 20mm is not wide enough. Something really interesting to note though is that if I am using this on a full frame camera, I would feel pretty comfortable just bringing this one lens to capture landscape photography. Of course, 28mm is not ideal, but if I wanted one camera to kind of do everything for me, I would just pair that with a 20 to 400. We have to talk about the APS-C versus full frame differences, and for me, I actually like using this a lot on my Nikon Z30, which is an APS-C size sensor, because we're able to turn this focal length into an effective 42 to 600mm. Now that is a really, really long focal range, and of course you are decreasing that wide angle side by going to 42mm, so it is getting a little bit tighter. But again, like, I'm not really going to be that worried about the 30 to 42mm focal range, because most of the time I am using this as a telephoto lens anyways. I would rather have that 600mm on the long end, which is where the APS-C advantage kind of comes in. Now, an effective 600mm focal length is just absolutely ridiculous for landscape photography. I rarely use it, if I'm being quite honest with you, but there are a lot of times where I'm just using this lens on a full frame body and I'm like, wow, okay, something is really far away and I really wish I had that 600mm to capture it. 600mm just gives you even more confidence that you can literally capture whatever you want. And especially with a lens like this, I think it's just a really nice pairing with something like an APS-C size body. So that's why I'm a big fan of using the APS-C size bodies on the 20 to 400. But of course, this is amazing to use still on a full frame body. And I like to use it with my Z6 and my Z6 III. And actually in my last shoot, I used it with my Z6 III and I think it did an amazing job. And especially with a camera like the Z6 III, we are able to use pixel shift, which again is very similar to HDR. Can't have stuff moving in there, but it will increase your resolution and your dynamic range. So with the 20-400, if you want to capture a composition but you just felt like it wasn't tight enough, you can go ahead and shoot that 96 megapixel image with pixel shift and then go ahead and crop in after. So there's a lot of different options that you can have with the 20-400. But of course, we can't talk about the focal length without talking about the image quality on this lens, because something that I was really interested about when it came to the performance was how the aperture performed, and I do have some answers now. So first of all, the aperture does go to f8 at around 200 millimeters, which is fine. It is what it is, but it gets dark pretty fast. When it comes to the aperture performance for 400 millimeters or 200 millimeters, I found that vignetting is probably the biggest thing that I want to mitigate, because at f8, the vignetting is pretty prevalent. I mean, it's not overwhelming, but it is definitely pretty noticeable. And as we stop the lens down to around f16 is when that vignetting really cleans up a lot. But here's what's interesting. When it comes to around 130 millimeters to 400 millimeters, the aperture is best performing at around f11 when it comes to corner sharpness, center sharpness, and so forth. Of course, the vignetting will be better if you use a 16, but diffraction does come into play even at 200-400 millimeters. So I really feel like if you're shooting between 130 and 400 millimeters, f11 is where you're gonna get the best performance, because it's gonna be sharpest in the centers, sharpest in the corners, and the vignetting does clean up quite a bit. But something that's kind of funny is that I did not know any of this while shooting my landscape photography, and so I would shoot a lot at f8. And if I'm being real with you guys, I thought the performance was fine. I didn't really notice anything that was too crazy, but it wasn't until I started doing the aperture test where I shot at all these different focal lengths and all these different apertures to really find out what was the best aperture. But something that's really interesting is that vignetting is normally a big issue when we're shooting panoramas, but I was able to shoot a panorama at f8 without any issues. There wasn't any weird dark diagonals that were coming up, and it actually looked really good straight out of the camera. I really don't know how big of a deal it is to have to stop down to f11 all the time, especially if you need more light, like when you're shooting a panorama and you want that faster shutter speed. I think f8 will be just fine. With 130 millimeters to 28 millimeters, f8 will be the best performing aperture, mainly because as we're going down in focal length, the apertures will be getting a lot brighter. For example, at around 28 millimeters is where we have an f4, obviously, and then 70 is where we have an f6 aperture. So we're able to stop down to f8 and get that better performance when it comes to vignetting, sharpness, corner sharpness, and things like that. So I really feel like if you're able to stop down at least one stop for pretty much any focal length is where you're going to get the best performance when it comes to sharpness, vignetting, and so forth. But talking holistically about this lens's image quality performance, I really feel like this lens is very good when it comes to the center sharpness. It's really just those corners when it comes to vignetting and corner sharpness where you really want to stop down to get that better performance overall. But when it comes to sharpness relative to other lenses, I think a really good comp is actually with the 24-200. Sharpness wise, those lenses are pretty much neck and neck, but this is not anywhere near the level of something like an S-line lens like the Plena. It definitely does not achieve that level of sharpness, but it is more than enough to get plenty of detail in your images, and your images will come out looking really good. And when it comes to things like micro contrast, this lens does look very nice. Of course, it is not super contrasty because there is quite a bit of glass in there, so it is a little bit more on the flat side, but I don't think that's an issue at all. Still plenty of micro contrast, images pop straight out of camera. Colors look fantastic, nice pleasant blues, clean greens, and I think overall I didn't really have to change too much when it came to post-production. So yeah, I know that was a lot of information to have to deal with when it comes to image quality, but now we can finish off with a conclusion, because the 20-400 is clearly an amazing lens for landscape photography. And the biggest reason why has to be that focal length. 20-400 just helps you capture everything and anything. And it just gives me so much confidence to know that whatever composition is out there, I can go ahead and capture it without fail. But especially pairing the 20-400 with the Z30 just turns it into a 42-600 millimeter lens. And with that, you will literally be able to capture anything that you want. And I think that's what's so great about this lens. It gives you so much confidence when capturing landscape photography to not have to feel like, oh, I wish I had a little bit of extra reach here. I wish I could capture this composition here. Don't have any issues with that lens. And I think that just makes me a better landscape photographer overall, because at the end of the day, a lens is supposed to give you a certain perspective in order to capture the world. And if a lens like this is able to give me essentially any perspective that I want, you're able to capture any image that you want, and in turn capture better landscape photography as a result. The lens is what you see the world through, and if you have a better one with a longer focal range, that is just going to help you capture better photos overall. And especially this lens relative to something like a 100-400, I will absolutely take this all day, because a 100-400 is not only larger, but is also heavier in size. And yes, it may have better performance, But I will take the performance of the 20-400 all day, especially because you could just stop down the aperture, which isn't really a big deal, especially if you're using a tripod. This right here is going to be my main telephoto lens for landscape photography. I will probably be using it most with the Z30, but with the Z6 III, I have no issue using it, especially because I have things like pixel shift to go ahead and capture higher resolution images. So let me know what you guys think of the 20-400mm lens. Is this a lens that you would put in your bag for telephoto use cases as a landscape photographer? Let me know down in the comment section down below. Anyways, guys, thank you so much for experiencing the world with me today. Please feel free to rate, comment, subscribe, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.